So we're starting to get into the meat of the letter to the Romans. And if you can remember back a couple of weeks ago, you'll remember how Paul started his letter. He introduced himself as the apostle who had been given a gospel all about Jesus Christ, right? We're going to see him all the way through this letter. But up front, he states that he's Jesus Christ, the Son of God, God's great King promised from of old in the prophets, in the Holy Scriptures, God's global King with a global call. The call to the obedience of faith among the nations. Every nation called to the obedience of faith in Jesus Christ. And then he began to talk about his plans, his travel plans, his longing to come to Rome to strengthen the Roman church and to reap a harvest among them. There's no one, Paul would say, who is exempt from this gospel call. And so he wants to strengthen the Roman church themselves so they live out the obedience of faith among the nations, and indeed to encourage and enlist them to get behind his calling to spread that gospel, to support him in it, and I guess themselves to engage in it as a church with a global reputation. But then last week, he began to explain why it is that we really, really need this gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, he says, because it's the power of God for salvation for all who believe, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. Because in it, he says, a righteousness from God has been revealed. And we need that, he said, chapter 1, verse 18, because, well, also the wrath of God is being revealed. Paul explained how, because of the universal suppression of the truth about God by humanity, the fact that we, instead of worshipping the God who made everything and giving thanks to him, we by nature suppress that truth about him and worship his creation instead, God righteously is angry about that. And as a consequence has handed us over to the consequences of that mindset and that attitude, working out in all kinds of different sinful behaviors. Paul says, because of our sin, that is to say, our denial of who God is and our determination to live without him, God in his righteousness has handed us over to all kinds of sins. It's a pretty devastating picture. It wasn't nice to read about, was it? But Paul put it there to convince us that the whole world really does need this gospel of Jesus Christ. But it might be that there are some people reading on who think to themselves, is it really true that everybody needs this gospel? Is it possible that there are some people who can look at the behaviours that Paul describes in 1:18 to 32 and say to themselves, yeah, but that's not me, Paul. I mean, I see that in the world around me. Your diagnosis of the world is true. I see a world that is handed over. I don't disagree with that. It's just not true of me. When I look at my behaviours, I don't think that's who I am or what I'm like. I stand above all of that. I'm distant from all of that. Because if there is that kind of person, well, all of a sudden you begin to think, does everybody need the gospel? Or is it possible that there's a different way of getting righteous with God, not through believing and trusting in Paul's gospel, but instead by behaving, pulling your socks up, doing better, so that you too could stand back and say, that's not me either. I'm okay. I'm not under the wrath of God. That's the question that drives us into chapter 2, almost as a whole, but certainly this week. Is there someone who perhaps doesn't need this gospel? So I want you to dive in and start reading it for yourself. But as you do that, let me give you one little tip to help you understand what's going on here. As you read these verses in chapter 2, verses 1 to 11, remember, Paul cannot be speaking directly to the Romans. The person he's going to talk to is someone who he describes as storing up wrath for himself for that future final day. And the wonderful blessing of being a follower of Jesus is, of course, we will not encounter wrath, God's righteous anger on that final day. We've been saved from it. That's the heart of the Christian message. So that means when you get into chapter 2, Paul isn't talking directly to the Romans or talking directly to us. He's not addressing us in that way. No, instead what Paul is doing, and he does this a lot in Romans and certainly across the whole of chapter 2 and the first half of chapter 3, he's employing a technique, a device as it were, whereby he comes up with an imagined figure. someone who might speak this kind of view, and he begins to engage in a dialogue with this person, a debate with this person. They're not a real person, but what Paul does is give us that dialogue, that discussion. It begins to feel a bit like a court case as you go along, so that the Roman church can eavesdrop in on that and be persuaded of the bigger points that Paul wants to make. Everybody without exception really needs this gospel. So enjoy reading it for yourself.